Our next reader is a freelance artist and writer from St. Paul. Her first novel in the space opera trilogy, the Vada Chronicles, is She is the End. Welcome science fiction and space opera writer A.C. Weston.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm reading off of a Kindle because my book isn't actually published yet, but it's available for pre-order from inkshares.com. Inkshares is like Kickstarter, but just for books. If you reach a certain pre-order level, they will publish your book. It's pretty fantastic so far. I've reached my order level, so my book will be published. Yay! But you can still pre-order it. I know, yeah, right? It's my first book. I'm really excited. But anyway, I think less is probably more. I'll just get into reading this and then do a little wrap-up at the end. All right. Rely felt the thread of the hunter through every nerve in her body. She moved on the balls of her feet, eyes dashing from the floor to the wall, down the hallway behind her. She reached a set of wooden stairs and leapt, skipping steps and tripping once, thudding and yelping. She heard someone pounding down the hallway toward her in savage pursuit. Someone wearing shoes. Lucky. She chose down by instinct, maybe, and she was right. She tumbled outside onto a narrow cobblestone street. Time-worn stone buildings with crumbling plaster facades loomed on either side. A steady drizzle pattered down. This was a walled city, very old but scrubbed clean. Earth. Buildings and streets like this did not exist in the developed galaxy. They kept everything new, swept the old away with no sentiment. She knew it must be Earth, but she didn't know this place. Not all Earth and towns were the same. Rely ducked into a recessed doorway, heaving in air from the exertion. She felt like she hadn't moved in months, years even. Maybe she hadn't. Her memory ended only a few minutes ago when she had lain down to sleep in a travel pod, counting down from 40 with deep, even breaths. She'd been so ready, set firm in her choice to go home. She was supposed to wake up at the Kalani Nakia dock, greeted as Orist, despite her rejection of the title. Instead, she was here, mud splattering up her aching legs, holes torn in her wrists, probably a concussion. Maybe she'd been asleep for decades. She saw movement far down the street, heard voices. Move, go! She inhaled and kicked up desperately for the wall. She slipped on the wet, uneven pavers and scraped her knees and looked back, and she saw him. He was coming. Oh, gods. She dug her fingernails into the grit of the street and pulled herself up. He was gaining ground. Gate. Let there be a gate. No gate. She ran along the wall, had to come to one eventually. The street veered away ahead of her, and the ground was built up against the wall. She didn't need a gate. She scrambled up the incline. The city walls were shingled with red half-cylinder tiles that cascaded down with every step Rely took. She heard a rival downrush of pottery thrown loose by her pursuer shatter against the ground as she slid to the edge and leapt out into the air. The ground met the outer wall, a merciful 10 feet below. Centuries of accumulated earth softened the original height of the ramparts. Her landing turned rapidly into a roll, and then a tumble down a steeper, increasingly rocky hillside. Her head missed the corner of a boulder by a few inches. Her hand caught it instead. She'd feel these bruises later. Now, run. When Rely found her feet, she stumbled onward. Her hunter slowed himself on the hill, taking it more carefully, but he came out steady and unharmed at the end of it. She tore through a field of brush, thistles snatching at her robe, at her skin, and she burst out onto a well-defined lane. She saw ordered rows, heavy branches, and she knew this. She could remember what this was. A place for growing fruit for wine. A vineyard. A Ha-Adam base. Through hazy darkness, she made out a stone pathway. She could lose him in the vineyard, maybe. Then her pursuer reached the pathway. He took a shot, missed, and she could hear him drumming closer and closer, an immense, thundering monster bearing down on her. Another shot. Rely fell, hit by a spray of sizzling plasma in the shoulder, and rolled through the mud. She had no time to recover before he was on top of her. She couldn't see his face, couldn't clear the rain or the mud from her eyes, from her nose, and he flattened her on her back. She struggled, but he pinned her arms against her sides between his shins and sat on her stomach and wrapped his hands around her neck. He pressed down. She felt his whole body quake. She couldn't speak. He didn't, for a moment. She couldn't see, could only feel, could barely breathe. She kicked uselessly. He growled, "You should know the pain you've caused." Rely saw light in her eyes. "You should suffer for your crimes, for what you've done. You should die in the mud." Rain splashed down on her face, running in a stream from his head looming over her. She was dying. She was supposed to be better than this. She was supposed to be stronger. Everything was bright, and it hurt. Stars. And then he let go. His weight lifted off of her, and she heaved in air, rolling onto her side with one hand curling around to cup the wound in her shoulder. She lay there, breathing and regaining her mind. The noise of the rain made her want to sleep. Now she felt the cold. She looked up and saw him in the light of the city, just barely. He sat hunched next to her, close enough to touch. His arms were resting on his knees, head resting in his hands. His body still shaking. The rhythm like a song. 1, 2, 3, rest. 1, 2, 3, rest. Rely felt a tightly stretched wire inside of her loosen. What day is it? Where am I? What the hell is this man talking about? Rely had little time to ponder because the ground jolted in what appeared to be a mechanized earthquake. They both gripped stones in the path, and Rely turned and saw that the hilltop behind them was rising. No, to the left and right, dark edges rose in equal time. They were sinking. The entire vineyard was sinking. They dropped 10, 20, 30 feet, and then Rely tumbled sideways as a gap split blade sharp down the stone pathway. 2 tracks of light dotted the edge of the new scene. And she'd seen these lights before, from the windows of ground ships coming and going from an underground hangar. The doors to the dock were the vineyard itself, drawn underneath and safely untouched while vehicles came and went. The jolt rocked the man sideways too, but where his right foot and thigh had been resting, he found only open air. Rely saw his arms flail. He tried to spin, fingers scratching stone, and then he fell. She felt the sudden plunge in her stomach like she herself had fallen. She gasped. Rely rolled onto her chest and looked over the edge. Luck had caught him. He hung by a forearm slung through the strap of his electric shotgun, which had snagged on a rod protruding from the vertical edge of the vineyard door. The strap was slipping. How deep must the dock be? Deep enough to kill him. Rely leaned out further. It was so close, only 3 or 4 feet away. She tested her grip on the edge of the pathway stone, slid herself out, and hung her weight on that stone. She could reach it. She could just reach the rod that held the strap. He looked up, and his body tightened when he saw her reach out. His face clenched through desperation and fury and then bitter resignation, and he refused to look away. Rely threw out her hand and managed to touch the strap. She clawed with her fingernails, pulled, and moved the strap back onto the rod. She pressed her hand over it and held it fast. "Climb up!" she managed to croak out. He swung his free arm up and gripped the rod, then slapped another hand over the lip of the door. His arms were much longer than hers, his hands much bigger, and she shuddered at the sight of them. Just as he dragged himself up and scrambled gracelessly over the edge to safety, the vineyard creaked to a stop. Rely pushed herself back at an angle, away from the chasm and away from her attacker, never taking her eyes off of them. The man remained hunched at the edge. He'd brought his gun up with him, and he held it to his chest as they sat back and stared at each other. He was much younger than she'd expected, but it was hard to see past the heavy beard. He glared at her, still furious, but now with an edge of uncertainty. Rely finally found her voice, and her words came out thick and rough through the bruising on her neck. "Who are you?" So that's the ending of the first episode of the book. There are 12 episodes. Those are the two main characters, Rely, and you'll have to read, find out. But it's a space opera. It starts out on Earth, and Rely is a princess who gave up her throne, and somebody kidnapped her and took over in her name and did a lot of horrible things, including decimate the population of an ethnic group on her home planet. One man escaped, hunted her down to bring her to justice, and that is who caught her. And so they form a tentative alliance to go back together and take her planet back. And the freebie that I have to give away is a coloring page from a coloring book a bunch of authors and I made to advertise our books. So this is a coloring page. There are a bunch over there. The information on the back is out of date because Inkshares changed their funding model. But I can talk to you about that in person if you want. The link's still correct. Okay, thank you very much.